we will be legislating within a few weeks to strip dual citizens involved in terrorism of their Australian citizenship. For a long time, since 1948 in fact, the Citizenship Act has provided that a dual citizen who is fighting against our country will automatically forfeit citizenship. In the old days, fighting against our country normally involved service with the army of an enemy nation. These days, fighting against our country can often involve working with terrorist groups that have pledged to do us harm and are urging people to do us harm. So what, in effect, we're proposing to do is bring this element of the Citizenship Act into the modern world. We're making it more contemporary, if you like.
You're watching The World from Below, and we're speaking with Jessie Smith and Ecehan Gulbayrak. This week, in the clip you just saw, the Abbott government advanced its proposal to allow the Minister for Immigration to cancel the citizenship of dual nationals who are accused of terrorism offences. This comes in the wake of legislation passed which imposes significant penalties for foreign fighters returning from places like Syria and Iraq. Jessie, how does the law deal with foreign fighters?
Well, it treats them very harshly. Most terrorism offences and foreign incursion offences attract life imprisonment. There are other related offences of going to a declared zone in Syria which attract, I think, 10 years imprisonment now, but certainly very austere penalties. And as the clip has just raised, there is also the prospect of an ancillary loss of citizenship, which I think is interesting because why this category of offence is seen as more un-Australian than any other criminal offence, I'm not sure how that's rationalised. I mean, certainly all criminal offending is contrary to Australian values, such as murder and child sex offenders. But it has been introduced into the political theatre, and I think that is very inflammatory, really, because from what we sort of understand of the profile of foreign fighters and who are going, they are marginalised, disgruntled youth, attaching more and more serious penalties, making this more and more about whether you're Australian or you're un-Australian, in the club or outside of it, I think doesn't grapple with the, I guess, the dilemma of social cohesion that we're experiencing, which is really the undercurrent of all this offending. So certainly now from a criminal law perspective, it's a very fraught thing to do to travel overseas, to engage in conflict in either Iraq or Syria.
Ecehan, in global terms, Australia certainly has in the past, although that's changing, a significant number of citizens who have travelled to Iraq and Syria to fight with the Islamic State. Do we know more about why these young people want to do that?
Each individual have their own convictions and reasons for going, but I think one particular trait or one particular reason for them deciding to go overseas or taking such a drastic step has been that, you know, again, those feelings of alienation, the feelings of helplessness, wanting to do something overseas and feeling as though that, you know, certain institutions are fueling into, you know, these wars and conflicts and, you know, trying to get involved and help out the wider community or the global community in terms of trying to bring about peace. So ultimately the intentions are meant to be somewhat good, but unfortunately, because of, you know, the current, I guess, the current state which we live in and also the climate, it's not preferable for them to obviously go overseas and further incite this sort of violence. So as a community, we condemn them going overseas, or anyone even thinking of going overseas. It's completely wrong. It's not a war that should be fought by anyone. There should not be a war, period. However, again, the reasons why these youths are going are because they're ill-informed. Again, they want to do something about it. And currently, like Jessie mentioned too, about, you know, the un-Australian and Australian rhetoric, most of these youths are born and raised in Australia. They have some sort of connection overseas, they might have some sort of background, and they feel, again, like they need to do something. So again, this feeling of alienation from the wider Australian community only fuels this rhetoric.
Jessie, I wanted to talk more about this proposal to strip citizenship because it seems like a drastic measure, but there's a lot of talk about whether it should be done subject to a court finding of guilt and a criminal prosecution. So I want to see what your thoughts are on that. But secondly, also, there's a range of powers that are already available to deal with foreign fighters. To what extent do you think a drastic measure like cancelling citizenship is necessary?
Oh, I think it's completely unnecessary for a whole host of reasons. I think that our criminal law has sufficient penalty. There is no greater penalty than jail. And that is the best way to strike a balance between deterrence, denunciation, all the sentencing principles that are captured by a criminal court.
There was a man who was killed in a drone strike and his children are left without a parent, obviously, but there's a question as to whether they should return to Australia.
Yes.
That seems to be quite a confounding issue politically for many people, but you do wonder what the benefit would be in that setting of stripping someone of citizenship, then denying also young children the ability to return to a place that they've called home. What do you make of that?
Look, I think a lot of people who are overseas will want to at some stage return. Obviously, there needs to be a security assessment of each case. I don't deny that. But I think they have a right to return. I think that we have an obligation to rehabilitate those people, especially when you're dealing with children who have seen the absolute horrors of war. And I think in that particular case, if the father has passed, then Australia should make every effort to repatriate them. It can't be another state's burden. They are Australian nationals. They may have another claim to citizenship in another country, but that does not mean we export our problems. So,
Obviously, Tony Abbott gets a lot of political mileage out of these kinds of issues, but I do want to know what it feels like, I suppose, Ecehan, to be under this weight of expectation to be constantly explaining for Muslim people who may have committed offences. Can you tell us what that is like?
It's actually quite tiring. I think for the community it's quite damaging because most of the time the community is trying its utmost best to, I guess, be an Australian and be part of the wider society. We're not trying to be, these weirdos who stick out like a sore thumb. Most Australian Muslims are Australian and they're born and raised here predominantly. I think there was a statistic stating that over 50% of the Muslims living in Australia are born here. So that's quite a big portion. And so it's unfortunate when there are criminal issues that are raised and whatnot that the spotlight's put on the Muslim community because most often than not the Muslim community feels as though these individuals aren't representatives of the community and that they're just a sole, individual who's got their own determinings, who's got their own beliefs, and who have decided to do something on their own individual basis. So it is very difficult for the community to constantly have to justify or have to find reasons for individuals when in fact it might not even be the responsibility of the community.
especially when these kids aren't necessarily part of traditional community structures. I mean, if they're not going to mosque, if they're not participating in Islamic cultural activities as a sort of community network, then how is it that the Islamic community must keep bearing responsibility for these kids?
That's a good point, yeah, because most often than not, the Muslim community isn't even aware of these individuals. So we find out about them and then we're having to get in contact with their families and find out more about the individual and then try and understand what went wrong, what's the issue.
And assuming a very tense environment where law enforcement is involved, I think that's more difficult than...
Yeah, so there's already those issues pertaining to trust and mistrust and whatnot. So you've got that, and then all of a sudden families feeling very, very defensive about these issues and wanting to get involved in any sort of way. So yeah, it's definitely very difficult.
You're watching The World from Below, and we'll be back after this short break to talk more about counter-terrorism and racism. Stay with us.